I'd like to spend the next 20 minutes or so just talking about why we're here and the work that we're trying to do in the Six Rivers project here in Iceland, the Six Rivers activity in Iceland. Then we'll have a discussion, an overview and discussion of work to date, and then I'll pass on to what is a pretty exciting agenda of speakers for today, and we'll come back to the Six Rivers later in the conference. So why are we here? Context. I've used this slide before, and on this slide we have a bar chart, and the left-hand bar chart is the growth of the human population in recent times, and at the same time, towards the right of the chart, we have what's been happening to certain key species in the universe. And though we see as humans are growing fundamentally, species are becoming more threatened, and the Atlantic salmon is one of those in our view. And really, why we're here today, it's for that reason. I just wanted to delve a little bit more into this, however, and talk about extinction rates and what that means for us. On this chart, on the left-hand side, I've got some information from the Royal Society, a recent paper, a very good one actually, on what's happening on extinction rates. I'm not going to go into the detail of all this, but basically to go from the left of this chart through the 1500s, through more recent times, and looking into the future, extinction rates of species are going up very substantially. And 1,000 times faster than the year 1500, and 10 times faster than 100 years ago. And for me, that's actually quite stark reading. And if we delve a bit further into one of the species on this chart, which are bird species, and look what's been happening there, again, it's the same source of information, the Royal Society, then we can see a red list. And there is a red list for birds. And about 11-12% of the birds on the planet are actually on the red list, this bird species on the planet. And what you can see on the left-hand side of this chart is those balloons going from the top of the red list, which is somewhat threatened, down to the bottom, extinct. And that is happening pretty much as we speak. And in fact, nearly 160 bird species have disappeared in the last 30 years. And as I said, the Atlantic salmon is on this red list now. For example, in Norway, the Atlantic salmon is on this red list. And it's near the top of the red list, but we don't even want it on the red list. We need to push it in the other direction. The good news is that good conservation work can actually help species. And so rather than just see this red funneling downwards, with good conservation work, we can see species being lifted up and out of ultimately of the threatened status. So Atlantic salmon threatened, very much threatened in our view. That's a common element across the sort of mammal-animal kingdom. A lot of species threatened, but a key message, good conservation work can actually help and improve the status. And that's why the Six Rivers project is here. It's why we're here today to discuss how we can go about doing that and how we can continue to do that and improve our performance, I guess, in the Atlantic salmon area. So that's the context as far as we're concerned, certainly as far as I'm concerned as well. And we've seen this NASCO chart before, but I thought it was worth putting it up against. This is NASCO from 2019. It's assessed a lot of rivers in the world, and basically, roughly, nearly half of them are at risk, and 174 of them no longer have salmon. I mean, those numbers might be slightly out of date now, but they won't have improved, I don't think, since 2019. We're going to hear later in the conference about one particular area where we're having success, where actually one nation is having success and one institute is having success in restoring salmon, and that's in Denmark. We'll hear tomorrow about that. But generally speaking, this is a pretty bleak picture. And it's very good to hear the minister say that Iceland is rejoining NASCO because the Iceland rivers aren't on this chart because they were out of NASCO. So in the future, we'll see the Icelandic rivers on this chart. So that's the sort of context. And as the minister said, in Iceland, so far, it's been pretty good, actually. There's been oscillations in the catch data over the last 40-odd years, but generally speaking, oscillating about an average. You could argue recently, however, that's been going down. And if we look further into that, as we will do shortly, we'll see some of the potential reasons why. So that's the context, that's the introduction, and now I'd just like to talk about our approach in the Six Rivers Iceland project and some of the early work, and use that as a way of introducing some of the other material that we'll hear about later. So firstly, Six Rivers Iceland, what is it? Well, first of all, it's a holistic conservation program. It's not about just looking at the river, it's about looking at the land, river, community. It's really important we bring all these things together, and I think later in the conference we'll hear that in a completely different context in Africa, for example. We know we have to act now, so another key point is actually getting on with stuff now, actions we can take now to improve, but also combining that with some longer-term scientific research and giving us guidance for the future. And it's a bit of a cliche, but it really is true. We want to leave the river, the land, etc., in better shape than we found it and improve. And we also want to make this a sustainable model. This is a key thing, I think, about our project. We want to use world-class fishing revenues and feed those back into research and community and conservation to help improve the lot of the Atlantic salmon. Where is our project? I think most of you know where it is already. It's in northeast Iceland. It's very interesting because it's a very, very clean system by comparison to many in the world, and that makes it a good area to make interventions and do research and so on. Looking more carefully at those rivers and thinking about that average catch we saw for Iceland as a whole, then if we pinpoint our own rivers in northeast Iceland, these 6 rivers in East Iceland, then we see that same peak about 10 or 15 years ago, but we also see that deterioration in numbers since. And yes, it's come back to roughly the average for the period, but is that an indicator of something? Well, we don't want to take that risk. We want to do something now and make sure that that trend does not continue and hopefully reverses. One key element of our program we'll come to in a second is catch and release. I just wanted to show this chart, which shows the impact of catch and release on the river Sellau. We will see this later, I think, with Hlynur. But as you see, catch and release was started in earnest here about 30 years ago. And you can see that on the green line, the percentage of catch and release has increased over time. And as that catch and release increased, then numbers increased in the rivers. But even with catch and release, still those numbers have come down recently, and we want to make sure that trend is not continuing. So main themes for our research in the 6 rivers. Well, item 1 is improve infrastructure for world-class fishing. That is the source of the revenues, the source of the funding, and so on. We want to deliver that sustainable model. One thing we're very keen on, that's the second point on here, is managing fishing pressure. And there's evidence in a number of systems that overfishing takes place. We have introduced measures to make sure we're managing that fishing pressure. Extension of breeding grounds. We know there are areas in our rivers that are available in principle for salmon, and we're working towards delivering those. We know that food supply is an issue here in northeast Iceland, and I think in other systems people are seeing that as well. So we want to do something about food supply, biomass going into the river, supplying the fish in the river. And we want to understand the population, so we're doing a lot of work on tagging to understand population. And we're also developing models to try and bring that information together to guide us in the next steps to take and guide us in interventions. So let's just go through those themes on our 6 Rivers project. First of all, managing fishing pressure. We've actually introduced some angling rules. And as I said just now, all fishing, catch and release. We have time periods during which the fishing can take place. So maximum 4-hour sessions, 2 per day. 2 fish in any pool, and any 4 in a session. And each angler must be guided, and we limit hook size to 12 and no sinking lines. Some fairly simple rules on angling rules that doesn't detract, in our view, from the angling itself, but does help us manage fishing pressure, which we think is an important facet. So that's angling rules. The second is extension of breeding grounds, and we'll hear from Stebby later in the conference on some of this, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. We're looking at 2 areas of extending breeding grounds because we know surveys tell us there are breeding grounds available. We're looking at the physical, so access around waterfalls. We've done quite a lot of work on that. Options for new ladders. And we're also looking at relocation of adults. We're doing quite a lot of work on relocating the wild spawning adults and introducing them to new areas of the river. And as we talk about tomorrow, we have evidence that that seems to be working in terms of populating those new areas. And we've done egg planting, which is again using wild eggs to do the similar sort of thing in certain of the rivers as well. And that is yielding gradually some success. And as I say, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Later today, one of our students, Sammy, will talk about assessment of food resources and the feeding habits of the fish. This is addressing the question of what is the availability of biomass in the rivers and what are the fish actually feeding on. And that will help guide us as we go forwards in understanding how to supply that biomass, which I'll come to in a second. So we know that food resources are limited, but Sammy, as she'll talk about, has surveyed our rivers and looked at biomass availability in the rivers and is making some conclusions from that. I won't steal her thunder now, but it's a pretty extensive survey which provides us with a good baseline as we do other things. One of those other things is planting. We know that biomass is in limited supply in the rivers. We know that's potentially a limiter across the river systems. And so, we've done a survey, and we're doing a forestation program. We'd like to add biomass around the catchment areas of the rivers by tree planting. Slow progress, obviously, tree planting. It's a long-term program. But in the next couple of years, we expect to reach 100,000 trees per year in the catchment areas. And beyond that, I guess our ambition is we'd like to see ourselves planting 1 million trees a year in the future. So food in short supply, we're looking at that, getting a baseline, improving vegetation around the rivers to encourage the biomass, and we'll be able to monitor those changes as we go through. Next topic is understanding the population. And we're doing a lot of work on juvenile tagging to understand the population dynamics, get some really hard data on return rates and so on. And so we've equipped the Vesterdalsau River with 3 antennae, which can identify small induction tags that we place in the fish. Those are unique tags. We label the fish with those unique tags, and we look at their behavior in the river, and when they smolt, we look at their leaving from the river and understand sort of survival rates and so on. So that's something we've had going in since 2019. You've all seen this data, and I'm sure you'll see other charts like this. I think Rasmus is going to talk about a couple of charts like this later on a different river. But what this allows you to do, for example, is obviously see the smolt run. So this is the smolt run from 2020. You can see that they all disappear from the river, smolt and leave the river around that June time when the temperature of the water rises. But immediately we see that we're losing roughly 50% of the smolts before they actually get out of the river, up to 50%, not always 50%. We're building the body of data that will give us firmer information on that. And we're also seeing that the effective return rate is less than 2%. And we're already using that information to plan what we can help with for the next smolt run later this year. And there are ways of protecting the smolts during the run. So tagging, giving us important information about the population. What are the results to date? I just thought it was worth having in your packs some examples of the data. This just illustrates that we're trying to tag around 1,000 smolts a year. 1 year it was poor conditions for tagging, in 2020, so we tagged rather fewer. But roughly 1,000 or so smolts per year. We're looking at the 1 sea winter return rates, the 2 sea winter return rates. You're getting a balance there. That will build up over time, that data. We'll understand it more over time. But you see the return rates there at 1.3 and 0.6%. Rather low return rates, and frankly, I think lower than many expected before we started this work. But as I say, we've got to build that data up and get some firm data around it. Information on tagging, I think, is obvious. Correlations with where you put the fish, where you tag the fish, the size of the fish, mass of the fish, and so on. Movements in the water, etc. Again, building that body up, evidence up over time. The team doing this work, just to draw to a close, well, we have a great team doing the work, actually. And we've got the Six Rivers Iceland team, Gisli, Stefan, Stebby, Denny, Sven, and Helga, who are all here today. We have the Marine and Freshwater Research Institute with Gudni, head of the Freshwater Division, and Hlynur, who will be talking later today. We have Sammy, who's working there as a PhD student. Imperial College, we have Guy Woodward and James Rossendale involved. Guy Woodward, an ecologist. We have Olivia Morris, who's our PhD researcher. And I also recognize Rasmus here, Rasmus Lauritsen, because he helped us set up the tagging techniques in the first place. So that's the team. That's a reminder of what we're about. We want to leave these rivers in better condition than we found them. We're taking that holistic approach, looking at river, land, community, the social aspects as well. And we want this to be a sustainable model, as I say, using the revenues we can create from excellent infrastructure and superb fishing, and funnel those back into the conservation. And obviously, it's long term. We're here for the long term. So with that, I'd like to close. Thank you.